As you know, we've heard from Federal Finance Minister Simon Birmingham about last night's budget, but I'd love to hear from our resident economist, Saul Eslake, about his thoughts and what these pre-election promises mean for Tasmania. So, Saul, a very good morning, mate. Thanks for your time.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on your program again, mate.
Now, what's in this budget for Tasmania, Saul?
Well, there are the usual specific pieces of pork that you expect to find in any pre-election budget.
In the barrel.
And, as is always the case in Tasmania, that pork is much more liberally distributed across Bass and Braddon, and in this occasion also extending into Lions, which the coalition has hopes of winning at the next election. Indeed, they thought they were going to win it last time until they discovered a few things about their candidate that they wished they'd known before they pre-selected her. But there is very little for Hobart, whose two seats haven't sent a coalition MP to Canberra since 1990 and don't look like doing so on this occasion either. So, there's lots of roads projects and things like that for the Northwest, the Northeast and the Great Eastern Drive that was specifically mentioned by the Treasurer in his budget speech last night. There's money for the Don irrigation scheme up on the Northwest Coast. There's a small amount of money for assisting people with mental health issues after the disaster at Hillcrest Primary School just before Christmas last year that got a mention. There's some additional money for some mental health services in and around Launceston. So they're all relatively small ticket items, but what you expect to find in the lead up to an election. Amongst the bigger measures, the headlines are, of course, the assistance being offered directly to pensioners and other social security beneficiaries to assist them with the impact of higher fuel and food prices on their cost of living. And since Tasmania has proportionately more pensioners and beneficiaries among our population than any other state or territory, I guess you could say we do disproportionately benefit from that. Although, of course, we have more people who have difficulty coping with increases in the cost of petrol, which is higher here than in almost any other part of Australia for reasons I've never totally understood. Likewise, we have a higher proportion of taxpayers who will be eligible for the extra $420 that comes along with the so-called low and middle income tax offset. So while that's not specifically designed for Tasmania, Tasmania will get a slightly bigger share of it. Tasmanians will benefit from the reduction in fuel excise for 6 months. Whether they need assistance with that or not, I think that's an untargeted measure. And, I don't like paying more than $100 to fill my car, which I did for the first time in my life in Australia a couple of weeks ago. But I can cope with it. I don't really need assistance paid for by other taxpayers or done with borrowed money in order to lighten my burden a little bit. So, I'm not a great fan of untargeted measures like the cut in the fuel excise, but the other ones I think are appropriate. There could even have been perhaps a little more of that. I also approve of the fact that the government directed almost 70% of the windfall revenue gains that it's getting from higher than previously forecast commodity prices to reducing deficits and debt over the medium term. In fact, by comparison with the Howard government at a similar stage of the electoral cycle in 2007, and perhaps not coincidentally at a time when inflation was also rising and the Reserve Bank was putting interest rates up, the Howard government did an awful lot more electoral bribery than the Morrison government has done in this most recent budget, although more of it was in the form of income tax cuts and less in the form of spending. But, by that benchmark, Treasurer Frydenberg was comparatively restrained in doling out the pork in the election budget. The other thing that I think is of significance to Tasmania is the fact that we're not going to see any benefit here from the upward revision to estimates of GST revenues that were included in the budget, because all of that's being siphoned off and handed over to Western Australia.
I actually had a chat. I mentioned the question. Would you like to hear?
I would love to hear what your guest, the Finance Minister, said in response to that.
I mentioned we spoke with Finance Minister Simon Birmingham earlier this morning regarding GST, and we asked him, how can you justify borrowing almost $15 billion over the next 4 years, almost $19 billion since 2021, in order to give the same amounts to WA, the only government in the country which is running budget surpluses, which is because it's swimming in iron ore royalty revenue. And Saul, this was his response.
Mike, what you're alluding to there is the agreement we struck in relation to GST funding, that no state should get back less than 70 cents out of every dollar that they contribute in GST funding. Now, I'm sure if Tasmanians were seeing a situation where they were getting less than 70 cents out of every dollar back to support schools, hospitals, essential services in Tassie, they'd think it was a pretty raw deal. It had been a pretty raw deal for Western Australia, and what we negotiated was an arrangement to put a floor there, not a particularly generous floor. It's still only 70 cents out of the dollar, and that means that for every dollar of GST that West Australians are paying, 30 cents of that gets redistributed elsewhere around the country, including in additional support for Tasmania.
There you go. That's his answer to my question, Saul.
Well, yeah, that's what I would have expected, frankly. I couldn't have put the question better myself, but the answer was what I would have expected. If I'd been a South Australian, if I'd been one of Senator Birmingham's constituents, I would have been as appalled by his answer as I am as a Tasmanian. I mean, for him to say if Tasmania had been in that position, we would object to it. If we had iron ore royalty revenue, or, somehow if we were able to sell the same volume of abalone to the rest of the world that at the same sort of prices that Western Australia can sell billions of tons of iron ore to the Chinese without any great effort on their part, I'd be reasonably relaxed about not getting every cent in the dollar of GST we pay back, because we'd have money coming out our ears, and that's what Western Australia does. I mean, I think it's one of the worst pieces of public policy making I can remember in 25 years or so, that the federal government is adding almost $19 billion to the deficits it will have run by 2026, 27, by 2025, 26, $19.5 billion extra added to our debt in order to transfer that amount to Western Australia so it can run bigger budget surpluses. And moreover, not only is WA running budget surpluses and therefore hardly in need of the money, but it's the richest state in the country by a bigger margin than any other state has ever been in Australia's history. And what Simon Birmingham's referring to in the deal that was agreed, I mean, it was imposed, it wasn't agreed. The deal that was imposed by the Morrison government in 2018 unpicks principles which have been used to determine how federal grants to the states prior to the introduction of the GST 21 years ago, and since 2000 the GST are carved up among the states and territories. Those principles were first laid down in the 1930s in response to Western Australia's grievances about the financial arrangements at Federation, which prompted Western Australians in 1933 to vote 2-1 to secede from the Commonwealth. Western Australia, in some years during that period, got twice as much from federal grants as he would have gotten if they'd been handed out on an equal per capita basis for 70 years. They got more than they think they're entitled to now, and as soon as the rules change, and as soon as through no great effort on their part they become the richest state of the country and have to put into the pot rather than draw out of it as they had done for 70 years, they want the rules changed. And I think it's just disgraceful that the coalition government pandered to that greed on Western Australia's part, and it's equally disgraceful that the Labor Party have said that if they get into government they won't change it.
Can I ask a question in regard to, and going back to business investment, because long-term business investment remains, as far as I'm concerned, the missing link. The budget shows a severe business investment decline in the outer years, coupled with GDP growth back to 2.5%. Now, that's not the basis of sustained wages growth, is it?
What the budget papers show is that after 3 years of decline, business investment will rise by about 7% in the financial year that's about to end, and then increase by a further 9% in the 2022-23 financial year that's not far away from starting. And then the forecast is that it will grow by only 1% in the 2023-24 financial year. So after a pick up in the rate of growth, it falls back again. The level of business investment isn't forecast to fall. It's just not going to grow at faster rates. A lot of that is driven by cycles in mining investment, which can be hard to predict. But we are going to get, according to Treasury's forecast, 2 years of reasonably strong growth in business investment, and hopefully that will create jobs and generate returns on the capital that businesses have invested. I mean, yes, GDP growth more broadly is forecast to come back to 2.5% in 2023-24 and beyond, after exceeding 4% in the current financial year and averaging about 3.5% in 2022-23. But Treasury always forecasts that growth will come back to a long-run average in the second half of the 4-year forward estimates periods that the budget covers. They probably have their own ideas as to what growth might be, but that's what they always do by convention, is forecast a return to the longer term trend. And that's not an unreasonable thing for a forecaster to do. It's hard enough to get the year ahead right, let alone 4 or 5 years out into the future.
Listen, while the local unemployment rate and growth predictions, they've been tracking well compared with the national average, CPI growth and wages growth will probably not. It is, is it really a safe bet that given the state's housing price boom and really tight rental markets, CPI will continue to track closer to State Treasurer Peter Gutwin's prediction of 4% rather than his federal counterpart's 3%?
Well, to be fair to the federal government, they're forecasting a CPI increase now of almost 4.5% for the financial year that's going to end. That's over the year to the June quarter, and that's an increase of a percentage point, from where it was over the year to the December quarter last year. That's the last figure that we have available. The cut in the petrol excise will artificially reduce headline inflation a bit in the June and September quarters of this year. But we have to expect, given what's happening to prices around the world, for as long as the conflict in Ukraine is continuing, and I wouldn't pretend to know how long it will, that's going to keep upward pressure under inflation. And that ultimately is why, in my view, beginning in August, some people think it's going to happen sooner than that, the Reserve Bank will start lifting interest rates. I don't think rates are going to go up dramatically. I think the financial markets being too pessimistic as to how quickly rates will rise, but there's no doubt in my mind, and the budget papers acknowledge, that interest rates are going to go up.
No, I think we all agree with you there. CEO of I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions. CEO of the Tasmanian Council of Social Service. We often speak with Adrian a lot. Adrian Piccone said of the budget, and I quote, "This budget is a squandered opportunity to demonstrate that poverty is not inevitable. The pandemic proved that poverty exists in this country because federal government policy allows it to. For a short time, the government ensured all Australians had an adequate income, and we saw the impact. Families no longer needed food hampers, debt repayments increased, and people told us they could finally afford to see their dentist and GP. Australia faces major challenges in the years ahead. We need a government that is prepared to act by investing in our people and our communities," unquote. As an economist, what do you think of that?
Well, I think in one sense, Adrian is right that the measures that the federal government and state governments instituted during COVID had a significant but temporary impact in substantially reducing poverty. And governments were able to do that with borrowed money because the cost of borrowing was so cheap. Now, if there going to continue with measures like that, which I guess is what Tascos is arguing for, that some of the elevated levels of cash payments to households, the so-called coronavirus supplement and those sort of things that governments put in place during COVID, if they were to be made a permanent feature of the social security system, it would be harder for governments to fund that through borrowings as interest rates rise, and given how much debt they've already accumulated, the only way they could be funded would be by a government prepared to ask Australians to pay more tax. Now, there's a case to be made for that. I actually think that the budget papers tell us that government spending as a proportion of our national income is now on a permanently higher trajectory of about 26% of our national income over the medium term than it had been during the previous decade prior to the onset of COVID. And yet the government has a self-imposed rule that tax collections as a proportion of GDP can't exceed 23.9%, and that sounds like an arbitrary figure. It is. It's simply the average that taxes were as a percentage of our national income in the last two terms of the Howard government, when government spending was an average of 24 and a bit % of our national income. So in my view, if we want to pay for the spending to which we're already committed without racking up increasing amount of debts, at some point, some future government is going to have to bite the very politically difficult bullet of asking at least some Australians to pay more tax. And, I think at some point that conversation between the government and the people has to happen, but I can be pretty sure it's not going to happen between now and the next election.
Which will be the 14th of May, we tip. Now, from what I can tell too, digressing, there's been no mention of law reforms relating to digital economy, creating structural reform to address housing affordability. I mean, you've got always throw in the first home buyer grants that raise prices, or even a master plan for health, especially with an ageing population. I mean, is that overall a little bit disappointing?
Well, it's not surprising. Whether it's disappointing, I suppose, is another matter. To be as fair as I can, there were some measures in the budget that were, for example, giving tax breaks to small business, inevitably. Small business being the favoured child, more tax breaks for small business to invest in cyber security measures and digitalisation and so forth. There was a little bit of money for extra skills training in those sorts of areas, so there's a bit of that. With regard to health, the government would say that it's guaranteeing Medicare and it's putting more drugs on the PBS, which is always to be welcomed, and that Australians won't have to spend as much each year on drugs before they get the safety net provision cutting in that basically makes medicines more or less free after you've spent a certain amount over the course of a financial year. So there's a few things in that area, but beyond that, over the longer term, unless you're talking about defence, there's not really much by way of longer-term planning or vision, and maybe it's a bit too much to expect that in an election year when the focus is, as you say, on something that's got to be held by the 21st of May and may be held on the 14th.
Yeah, and I think on health, as you touched on, the Morrison government has said there's record investment in health, but the AMA, Saul, has said it amounts to little more than usual recurrent spending and planned growth, and not the new injection of funds that the health system desperately needs.
And again, that can't really happen unless a government is prepared to say to the Australian people, some of you, a lot of you, are going to have to pay a bit more in tax. And, at the end of the day, if governments aren't prepared to say that in the face of demands for more government spending, then either the government spending isn't going to happen or it's going to be done with borrowed money, which is ultimately unsustainable.
Do you think, this is where I'm coming from, I tend to think there'll be some real fresh big-ticket policies, tax cuts and spending pledges after Labor's done their answer to the budget, just waiting. I think they haven't pulled everything out of the closet yet.
Well, I suppose the budget sets the envelope within which Labor can draw up whatever plans it has, whatever promises it wants to make between now and whenever the election is held. And I dare say people opposition officers will be doing precisely that now, and we might get some insight into it tomorrow night when the opposition leader delivers his traditional reply to the budget, which will be on our TV screens just as Treasurer Frydenberg's speech was. But remember, the Labor Party is following a small target strategy this time around, having done a John Hewson in 2019, losing an election everyone thought they were going to win because they had an enormous shopping list of policy proposals, and which included tax increases which their leader couldn't defend in public debate. So just as John Howard in 1996 learnt from that by offering a very, very small target agenda, remember there'd never ever be a GST and all of that sort of stuff. Labor's promising the same sort of thing. Indeed, I reckon our political history shows that you simply cannot win an election from opposition for the first time on a platform of major change. The only way you can win an election as an opposition is to promise not to do very much at all, but to do what you are going to do more competently than the government that has been around for a while. And I mean, Will Hodgman did that in 2014. Tony Abbott did it in 2013. Every state government, which has been one for the first time, has promised not to do very much, but to do whatever they do more competently than the other mob. And woe betide any government that wins an election having promised not to do very much and then tries to do a lot, as, for example, Tony Abbott found out the hard way after he got into government, or Campbell Newman as Premier of Queensland did the same thing, and having won in a landslide, he lost in a landslide at the following election. So, Labor's not going to promise a great deal in between here and the next election. If Labor wants to do a lot of reforms in the way that Hawke and Keating did in the 80s and 90s, they're going to have to win an election first, govern competently and keep their promises during the first term, and then use all the enormous advantages that being in government has to seek a mandate for a bolder platform of reforms in a second election, knowing that not since 1931 have the Australian people not given a first-term government at least one more go.
Yeah, well said. So always a pleasure to have a chat. It's always incredible budget time. There'll be so many more chats very much in the near future, I think. Saul, great to talk with you again.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure for me too.
Saul Eslake, our resident economist with Tasmania Talks.
You might be able to beat Fairzy in a running race, but can